Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 615, and today is June 14th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Just a couple quick announcements before we get into everything today. Next week and the week after, my colleague at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, the guy who usually is bringing you most, if not almost all, the news stories every day, is going to be on vacation, and I am going to try to fill in for him, do my best to keep up with all the news. This may interfere with the schedule of the show somewhat next week. I am still going to try to put out an episode Monday through Friday morning. Not sure how possible that is going to be. So just a heads up, if you don't see a show one day, there'll be a show the next day. I'm just busy writing it and doing the best I can to do the most important stuff to fill in for Dave. Anyways, I appreciate all of your support, and additionally, I think we'll probably see a little bit of bump in the numbers over the next couple of weeks because Dave has a fairly sizable audience, and he's been sending his audience over here so people could keep up with the news while he's on vacation. So for Dave DeCamp listeners, welcome to Conflicts of Interest. You can subscribe to the show, find the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter. All the shows, all the articles I write, everything I put out ends up there at Kyle Anzalone_. Let's get into it today. First up here, we have an article for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, this by Nick Cleveland Stout. And he writes, military officials say Widowmaker Osprey will fly with a faulty clutch. So, during a House subcommittee hearing on June 12th, Vice Admiral Carl Chabey told Congress that the V-22 Osprey will continue to fly on a faulty clutch through mid-2025. But while it will fly at a lower capacity of only 30 minutes of the time, this will not have prevented crashes that killed 3 U.S. Marines last year. In the last 2 years alone, 20 service members have died in Osprey crashes. Finally, after a total of 64 fatalities and 93 injuries, Congress launched an investigation into the Bell Boeing V-22 Osprey, known as the, quote, Widowmaker. On June 12th, the House Oversight, National Security, Border, and Foreign Affairs Subcommittee called Chabey, advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Peter Belk. He's an advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and Program Executive for Air, Anti-Submarine Warfare, and Special Missions Programs, Gary Kutz, to address a recent uptick in the crashes. One of the questions for Congress was on the Osprey's aging clutch. As defense analyst Julia Geldhill explained in these pages last year, the Osprey's clutch will occasionally slip and disengage with one of the aircraft's rotors and can use the helicopter to lurch and nosedive, and it was known as a hard clutch event. So Chabey acknowledged during the hearing that over time, the clutch wears out and has a higher susceptibility to slipping, which will cause a hard clutch event. In 2022, we had a sharp increase in the number of hard clutches. Kuntz told the subcommittee on Wednesday that a rework on the clutch would be done sometime between mid-2025 and the third quarter of that fiscal year, although usually the Defense Department and their contractors run pretty far behind on when they get things done, so it could be 2026 or even later by the time this actually gets placed into the Ospreys. The Department of Defense also removed clutches that have over 800 hours, but will continue to fly the faulty clutch until then, putting more service members at risk. So the Admiral Chabey admitted that they have not eliminated the risk. Representative Stephen Lynch, who's from Massachusetts, disagreed with the decision to continue to use the faulty clutch. He said, "What do you think will be the consequences will be if we have another V-22 go down and we lose more brave Marines or airmen between now and that time," at which Mr. Kutz indicated that there would have the clutch situation figured out and deployed. your whole program is done. It's done. If another Osprey goes down, work done. This program is done. So why don't we ground this now? And Nick goes on to point out in this article that many of the Osprey crashes occurred when there was only 10, 15, 20 minutes of flight time. And so this 30-minute flight time limit really won't help to end the program. Additionally, one of the advantages of the Osprey was its longer flight time. And so if you only are able to fly this thing for a half hour, then a lot of other aircraft could serve the role without the risk of killing so many people. I think that article I wanted to talk about just because it's such a good reminder that our elected officials, our military, don't care about the soldiers, right? Anytime somebody like me says we shouldn't be doing something overseas or we should cut the military budget, a lot of times what will be invoked isn't the high, level foreign policy discussion, but just a rather lowbrow argument that I'm insulting the troops, I'm putting the troops at risk of death, or, we're insulting the legacy of the troops who died and gave their life, say for the Iraq or Afghan war, if you want to leave one of those countries. And this is just a reminder that the people who really care about the soldiers' lives are the people who want them brought home, who want the military-industrial complex brought into check so we don't lose scores of our servicemen in training at stints flying on faulty planes. All right, next up here, getting into some news on Russia. This is a follow-up from an article earlier in the week. Dave DeCamp, June 13th, antiwar.com. G7 leaders agreed to provide Ukraine with $50 billion using frozen Russian assets. So leaders of the group of 7 nations agreed at a summit in Italy on Thursday to give Ukraine $50 billion using frozen Russian central bank assets, a step that marks a significant escalation in the economic war against Russia. The plans to provide $50 billion to Ukraine by the end of the year in the form of a loan, which will be paid back for by profits of the approximately $280 billion in frozen Russian funds held by the U.S. and its allies. Important to note, the U.S. only holds about $5 to $6 billion of those dollars, so mainly this will fall on our allies. The idea is seen as a compromise between the U.S. and Europe. President Biden wanted to steal all the frozen Russian funds to give that to Ukraine, but the vast majority of the money is held in Europe, and EU leaders were hesitant to do that. Instead, the European Union devised a separate scheme to provide Ukraine with about $3 billion per year using the interest made off the Russian assets. Ukraine said that amount wasn't enough, and the U.S. provided proposed a $50 billion loan. So National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan told reporters, "This has been something that the United States has put a lot of effort into. We've seen proceeds from these assets as valuable source of resources for Ukraine at a moment when Russia continues to brutalize the country, not just through military action on the front, but through an attempted destruction of its energy grid and economic vitality." Russia has made clear it would view the plan either as theft of its sovereign funds and is preparing to retaliate. Stealing the money makes the reconciliation between Russia and the West even less likely, since lifting sanctions would mean having to give assets back to Moscow that have already been spent. And then, of course, too, if you have a loan here that Ukraine can't pay back, are the Western countries going to start paying the interest and the payments on that loan? Because Ukraine isn't going to be in position to, if Russia has the money back, that money won't be going to pay off this loan. And so these are really big and important questions that need to be answered here. And this is just another ham-handed Western policy to pump more money into Ukraine. And of course, it would be one thing if they were doing this after the war had ended and they were using this money to rebuild Ukraine. But of course, this money isn't even for Ukrainians. It's going to go to the Ukrainian government, and that's probably only going to be ostensively, it's probably never actually going to hit Ukraine. It's going to go to the Western military industrial complex, where we're going to make more military equipment that really isn't going to help Ukraine win anything back. It's certainly not going to turn the tides of the war, and is likely going to just lead to more death and destruction in Ukraine. So not only is this not in any way a solution, it just furthers the problem, and quite significantly so. All right, next up here, Biden and Zelensky signed 10-year bilateral military deal. So on Thursday, President Biden and President Zelensky signed a 10-year Ukraine-U.S. bilateral military agreement on the sidelines of the Group of Seven summit in Italy. The deal affirms that the U.S. will continue training Ukrainian forces, providing military aid, and helping Ukraine build up Ukraine's military-industrial complex, but the agreement could be easily reversed by a future president, and it is largely symbolic since it doesn't commit the U.S. to spend anything. U.S. officials told CNN that the deal was an executive agreement rather than a formal treaty, which means it doesn't need the approval of the Senate. The TED says that either party could scrap the agreement by providing a written notification through diplomatic channels to the other party of its intent to terminate. The deal says that if Ukrainian territory is attacked in the future, the two parties should hold consultations within 24 hours, but it does not provide a mutual defense guarantee. The TED says that the U.S. and Ukraine recognize the agreement as supporting a bridge to Ukraine's eventual NATO membership into the alliance, but it does not outline a clear path to Ukraine's membership. It only repeats the vague promise NATO members have given Ukraine at the Vilnius summit last year, and that was they would eventually invite Ukraine to join when allies agree the conditions are met. Zelensky fumed at the NATO summit last year over the vague guarantee, but he is celebrating the new deal with the U.S. and framing it as a path towards NATO membership. Today is a truly historic day, and we have signed the strongest agreement between the Ukraine and the U.S. since our independence, Zelensky said. France and some other NATO members are also working on plans to send troops to Ukraine for training, which will mark a huge escalation. But Biden said in his remarks the new agreement supports Ukraine without sending U.S. troops to the country. This is Biden's statement on it, not by sending American troops to fight in Ukraine, but by providing weapons and ammunition, expand intelligence sharing, continue to train brave Ukrainian troops at bases in Europe and the United States, enhancing interoperability between our militaries in line with NATO standards, investing in Ukraine's defense industrial base, so in time they can supply their own weapons. And of course, this, from my perspective, is good news. I was worried that they were going to they were going to do two things here. One, this would be a formal agreement that would commit the U.S. to go to Ukraine's defense in the event of an attack on Ukraine. Fortunately, that's not the case. I also thought they were going to try to make this some kind of formal treaty or formal U.S. law, and that would what they call Trump-proof, or bind the hands of a future American president from rolling back from these aid commitments. So good to see that those things aren't happening. The bad news here, of course, is the U.S. is planning to be involved in a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia for 10 years. Next up here, this one, Dave DeCamp, June 13th, antiwar.com. Stoltenberg says Ukraine using F-16s on Russian territory won't be an escalation. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg claimed on Thursday that Ukraine using NATO-provided F-16 fighter jets to strike inside Russian territory would not be an escalation. Several NATO members said the U.S. will send U.S.-made F-16s to Ukraine once pilots have completed training, and at least two, the Netherlands and Denmark, have said that Ukraine could use its jets to hit targets inside of Russia. The U.S. recently gave Ukraine the green light to use its U.S.-provided missile systems in strikes inside Russia near the Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast. The use of NATO weapons inside Russia risks provoking a major response from Moscow, but Stoltenberg has been shrugging off warnings. When asked about Ukraine using F-16s to strike Russian territory, Stoltenberg said he welcomed the idea. I welcome that allies have reduced or loosened their restrictions on the use of weapons also against military targets inside Russia, because we need to understand what this is. This is a war or aggression. So those are Stoltenberg's remarks. Stoltenberg said that Ukraine has a right to defend itself under international law, and that applies to strikes inside Russian territory. Self-defense is not escalation. Self-defense is a right enshrined in the U.S. Charter, and we have to the right to help Ukraine uphold that right. And so escalation seems to be the new word provoked, where they're going to claim, oh, this is an escalation. How could it be escalation? It's only self-defense. You can't escalate in self-defense. Well, yes, you can. And again, this isn't really the principle of the matter that Ukraine shouldn't be able to hit Russian targets as Russia is invading Ukraine, but rather what this means for the relationship between the US and Russia, the world's two largest nuclear powers, and the possibility of a direct US-Russia war. That's the real issue at stake here, not whether Ukraine has a right or not to hit Russian territory. So, Russian President Vladimir Putin has escalated the war in Ukraine several times in direct response to Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory, including the offensive in Kharkiv, which he said was launched in response to Ukrainian attacks on Russia's Belgorod region. The direct NATO support for strikes inside Russia risks another major escalation. Putin and other Russian officials have noted that F-16s could be armed with nuclear weapons and said they could be treated as a nuclear threat. A Ukrainian commander said some of the F-16s will be stored abroad to prevent them from Russian strikes, but that could make the NATO bases housing them potential targets for Russia. And just in, the same kind of principled way, I'm not saying I support this, but if Ukraine is using Romanian bases to launch F-16s from to carry out attacks inside of Russia, I think Russia would be quite right in seeing those bases as a legitimate target. All right, next up here is the article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. U.S. signs $23 billion deal for F-16s sailed to Turkey. So the U.S. has inked a $23 billion deal with Turkey for 40 F-16 warplanes. Washington promised to sell dozens of the advanced fighter jets to Ankara and upgrade scores, I believe about 80, of Turkish F-16s in exchange for Turkey approving Sweden's NATO membership. So the AFP reported the deal was signed on Thursday, and this is what a Turkish Defense Ministry source told AFP. The contract was signed and delegations from both sides are now negotiating the details. The State Department said last week it had taken significant steps towards finalizing the deal, which was proof of the deep military relationship between Washington and Ankara. In January, President Biden sent a letter to Congress pushing Capitol Hill to approve the sale of F-16s to Turkey. Washington had conditioned the deal on Ankara lifting its months-long obstruction of Stockholm joining NATO. Since joining the bloc in March, Sweden has taken an aggressive approach towards Russia. Stockholm has approved Kiev using its weapons against targets inside of Russia, and top Swedish officials have suggested Stockholm could join NATO's nuclear sharing program. Turkey was initially a partner in the F-35 project and was said to receive America's latest warplane. However, during the Trump administration, Ankara purchased advanced missile defense systems from Moscow, leading Washington to cut Turkey from the program, which is why they wanted the F-16s, and then they ended up using a block over Sweden joining NATO to leverage that to get the F-16s they sought. Next up here, this one, Dave DeCamp, June 12th, antiwar.com. U.S. sanctions more Chinese companies over trade with Russia. The Treasury Department announced more Russia-related sanctions on Wednesday that targeted companies based in China and other countries that are accused of supporting Russia's war economy. New sanctions were imposed on more than 300 individuals and entities based mostly in Russia, China, Turkey, and the UAE. So, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said in a statement, "We are increasing the risk for financial institutions dealing with Russia's war economy and eliminating paths to evasion and dismantling Russia's ability to benefit from access to foreign technology, equipment, software, and IT services. The U.S. has been trying to pressure China to reduce its trade relationship with Russia and announced its first significant round of Russia-related sanctions on Chinese companies last month. However, trade between the neighboring countries has increased in recent years in response to U.S. sanctions, and new ones aren't expected to discourage the growing relationship, and in fact, it'll probably throw more fuel on the fire, continue this growing relationship not only between Russia and China, but Russia and the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS bloc, which is fairly significant and the majority of the world's people are members of both of those blocs. So Russia has vowed that it will respond to the new U.S. sanctions. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said, as always in cases like this, Russia will not leave such aggression without actions in response. Following the announcement of the sanctions, Russia's main stock exchange said it was halting trade in the US dollar and the euro. The US and NATO accused China of fueling the war in Ukraine, even though Beijing doesn't send military aid to Russia, and it's the Western powers that have been pouring weapons into Ukraine and discouraging peace talks. It's kind of funny how this works, where the US is sending hundreds of billions of dollars of arms, dumping those into Ukraine, and then we chastise China for buying Russian oil and selling Russia products in return. So this is NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in April. China says it wants good relations with the West. At the same time, Beijing continues to fuel the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. They cannot have it both ways. And this is something that NATO's leadership, the US, and a few other countries in the bloc have wanted for some time, to really not only weaponize the bloc against Russia, but also against China. All right, next up here, Filipinos support military action to counter China. The South China Morning Post reports a new survey indicates an overwhelming majority of Filipinos support military action and diplomacy to counter China's perceived threat in the South China Sea. Such an analysis, which analysts say reflects growing public support for President Ferdinand Marcos, his nickname is Bongbong, and that's what a lot of people know him by, Jr.'s increasing assertive stance on territorial dispute. The survey conducted in March as a part of a series of private by private pollster Atta Research tracking Filipino attitudes on the South China Sea dispute since 2001, showed that 73% of the 1,200 respondents nationwide favored further asserting the Philippines' territorial rights through military action, such as expanded naval patrols and troop presence in the West Philippines or South China Sea. It's 12 nautical miles of sea territory. It's 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone, as well as the Kalayaan Island group outside of that zone, which includes the Pag-asa Island. However, resorting to diplomacy was a close second to military action in the survey, according to the president of Atta Research. So one thing that I've talked about throughout the Biden administration, and probably haven't spent enough time on given the wars going on in Ukraine and Gaza, is not only the tensions surrounding the U.S. support for Taiwan and how that's provoking Beijing, but almost more importantly, the U.S. is giving a lot more support to Manila, and this has really ramped up tensions in the South China Sea as well as the tensions that already exist in the East China Sea. All right, bad news here. Biden says there will be no Gaza ceasefire deal soon. President Biden on Thursday says he doesn't expect a ceasefire deal to be reached anytime soon as the Israeli slaughter and starvation of the Palestinians continue. According to the Associated Press, Biden was asked at the Group of Seven summit if he thought the truce deal would be reached soon. He replied no, and then added he still hadn't lost hope. His comments came a few days after Hamas responded to the ceasefire proposal that President Biden publicly outlined on May 31st. The Times of Israel reported that the main sticking point is that Hamas wants Israel to commit to a permanent ceasefire and to withdraw from Gaza up front. The initial proposal involved a first phase with a 6-week ceasefire. During that time, the permanent truce would be negotiated and implemented. In the second phase, Israeli officials thought the language was vague enough that Israel and Hamas could enter the first phase without Israel actually committing to a permanent ceasefire. And I think it was these comments specifically that led Hamas to ask for the additional assurances. So after Biden first outlined the proposal, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected it, saying he wouldn't agree to a permanent ceasefire until Israeli Israel achieves its goals in Gaza, which include the destruction of Hamas. Netanyahu's repeated rejection of a permanent truce led Hamas to seek stronger assurances. Despite Netanyahu's rejection of Biden's proposal, U.S. officials continue to claim it was accepted by Israel and are putting all the blame for the lack of a deal on Hamas. And as I talked about a lot on the last show, this is just one of the most disgusting cases of propaganda I've ever seen the U.S. government put out. That's really saying something. All right, Israeli soldiers aid or watch as settlers commit violent and deadly attacks against Palestinians. This is referring to the West Bank, and this comes from a report from France 24. They say in the West Bank, the line that never really existed between the army and the settlers has now been completely erased, and that is according to Joe Kamel, advocacy coordinator for Breaking the Silence, an Israeli anti-occupation NGO made up of former soldiers. So the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, reported 1,096 settler attacks on Palestinians in the territory beginning and this was only from October 7th to March 31st. That represents an average of 6 attacks per day, up from 2 attacks per day in 2022. The Israeli rights group Yehdin, which also records settler violence, said 2023 was already a peak year. With each attack, a similar story. Armed settlers, sometimes wearing the army's fatigues, attack Palestinian villages, burn their houses and cars, and steal their laptops, sometimes under the passive gaze of soldiers. So on April 13th, Palestinians in the northern West Bank village of Duma watched in terror as hundreds of settlers attacked their village and stabbed a villager after an Israeli teenager who often visited a nearby settlement outpost was found dead. Since the start of the war on Gaza on October 7th, at least 537 Palestinians have been killed by soldiers or settlers, according to the Palestinian Authority. On October 13th, settlers shot a 20-year-old, Zachariah al-Adra, at point-blank range as he was leaving a mosque in his village in the southern West Bank. The soldier saw everything but didn't move, according to his wife. Human Rights Watch investigated 5 attacks perpetrated by Israeli settlers in 5 different Palestinian villages between October and November of 2023, and concluded in April that the Israeli military either took part or did not protect the Palestinians from the violent settler attacks in the West Bank. Evidence shows that armed settlers, with the active participation of army units, blocked roads and attacked Palestinian communities on several occasions. They have detained, assaulted, and tortured inhabitants and evicted them from their houses and their lands, Human Rights Watch concluded. In April, UN Human Rights Office spokeswoman Ravina Shahdanasi told reporters in Geneva that Israeli security forces must immediately end the active participation in and support for settler attacks on Palestinians. Israeli authorities must instead prevent future attacks, including by holding those responsible to account. So the advocacy director for the Palestinian Union of Agricultural Work Committees said the settlers saw the far-right settlement champions Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich in the Israeli government as a green light to attack Palestinians. So Carmel, the first expert we are talking about from Breaking the Silence, says the Netanyahu's government goal is clear: to strengthen the settlement movement, and in doing so, making it impossible for Palestinians to have any chance of gaining an independent state. So really horrible what's happening to the Palestinians in the West Bank, and just should be getting more attention, but it's not, in large part because of the horrors that Israel is committing in Gaza. All right, next up here, this one, June 13th, Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Israel hurls fireballs at farmland in southern Lebanon. So Israel attacks on southern Lebanon have already seriously damaged farmland, and it now appears the situation is getting worse and less incidental. Footage shows Israel using a literal trebuchet to launch fireballs across the border at farms, setting serious fires. Trebuchets are a rotating arm variety of a cannonbolt, which was commonly used as the Middle Ages as a weapon for siege warfare. It wasn't clear why the Israeli military has such weapons in this day and age, as they fell out of favor in the 15th century. Supposedly, the fireballs are being used to clear the dense vegetation from the border region, as Israeli officials suggested that such areas serve as potential hiding areas for militants, which complicates defense in the area. In practice, both sides increasingly use fire as a weapon of war. Hezbollah rocket fire often hits openly bushy areas in northern Israel, setting fires that Israeli fire services struggle to contain. Widespread destruction of farmland has resulted from Israel's general attack on southern Lebanon and has greatly damaged the main economic infrastructure in the region. Hezbollah fired an estimated 40 rockets against northern Israel on Thursday. The group said 9 different military sites were targeted, resulting in several fires, as well as 2 Israelis being wounded. Israeli fighters carried out an attack on the area of Deir Syrian in southern Lebanon, attacking what was described as infrastructure. Israel also claimed to have intercepted 3 drones launched from Lebanon's southern regions. Last story up here. This one from Day to Camp. Last Day to Camp story we'll have for a couple weeks. Report: U.S. thinks Israel is rushing into war with Hezbollah with no clear strategy. So the Biden administration is concerned that the violence on the Israeli-Lebanon border could soon escalate into a full-blown war, and that Israel is rushing into the conflict without a clear strategy. U.S. officials told Axios that the administration has cautioned Israel against the idea of a limited war, warning that Iran could intervene and militants in Iraq and Syria could join the fighting. The report says the White House believes a ceasefire in Gaza is the only thing that could reduce tensions on the Israel-Lebanon border. However, Israeli officials have previously threatened to escalate in Lebanon if a truce was reached in Gaza. The report comes after Israeli airstrikes killed a Hezbollah commander who was described as the most senior member of Hezbollah to be killed by Israel since October of 2023. Hezbollah responded with a large volley of rockets. On Thursday, Israeli soldiers were spotted launching fireballs into southern Lebanon to start fires. According to a tally from the AFP, Israeli bombings in southern Lebanon have killed at least 468 people since October, including 89 civilians. On the other side, Israeli authorities have said that 15 soldiers and 11 civilians were killed by Hezbollah. The U.S. is calling for de-escalation on the border after the latest round of strikes, but there is no sign diplomatic efforts are making any progress. There's also no sign that the U.S. is putting any real pressure on Israel to change what it's doing in the north, since U.S. military aid continues to flow. Back in January, the Washington Post reported that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu viewed a war in Lebanon as key to his political survival. Biden recently said that people have every reason to believe Netanyahu is dragging out the onslaught in Gaza for his own political self-preservation. All right, everybody, that will do it for the show for the week. We will be back with a new show on Monday, and keep an eye on my Twitter feed and antiwar.com because I will be busy writing up news stories. Thanks, everyone.